Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and greetings to all my non-Muslim viewers and subscribers. Thank you so much for joining me today. We have another incredible interview lined up for you guys today with somebody who, I mean, usually my interviews are with people who are strictly academics working in the background of committees and translations and things like that. But today we have somebody who's not only a scholar and academic, but in my opinion, one of the best popularizers of that academic material that we have today, Dr. Dan McClellan. So join me in welcoming him. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Dan.
Thank you so much, and alaikum assalam.
Alhamdulillah. Thank you. So without me possibly fumbling your introduction, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your scholarship, your training, your academia?
So I position myself as a public scholar of the Bible and religion. I produce scholarship primarily intended for public consumption. I have 4 degrees in related to biblical studies and 1 vocational degree in massage therapy. But I did a bachelor's degree at Brigham Young University in Ancient Near Eastern Studies, where I focused on Hebrew Bible, but did a minor in Classical Greek. Then I went to the University of Oxford. I did a master's degree in Jewish studies there and wrote a master's thesis on it was entitled Anti-Anthropomorphism and the Forlaga of LXX Exodus. But basically, I was talking about textual criticism of the Septuagint.
Awesome.
And then I went to, I lived in Bellingham, Washington, just south of the border, and commuted across the border to lovely Langley, BC, just outside of Vancouver, to do another master's degree in biblical studies at Trinity Western University, where I focused on cognitive linguistics and wrote a thesis on the conceptualization of deity in the Hebrew Bible. And then I did my PhD through the University of Exeter, where I wrote my doctoral dissertation on the cognitive science of religion and cognitive linguistics, and how those methodological lenses inform how we understand the conceptualization of deity and divine agency and divine images in the Hebrew Bible. And that I later published as an open access book entitled Adonai's Divine Images, A Cognitive Approach with SBL Press. So if anyone's interested in reading that, the slightly less technical, but still somewhat technical discussion is freely available online. You can just Google the title, or you can go through my LinkTree to find access to that and all my other scholarship. So I would say I primarily focus on conceptualizations of deity, scripture, and religious identity through a variety of different methodological lenses.
Awesome. Yeah, that's quite a diverse catalog of fields.
It's a problem. Yeah, it's hard to stay up to date on everything.
I know. Yeah, like when I first started getting into my hobby, I'm a hobbyist, I guess, in textual criticism and transmissional studies. It was just strictly textual criticism. Then a little bit of redaction criticism. And then when I started learning patristics, all of the information that I learned about textual criticism just like melted out the other ear.
Yeah.
I can hardly remember anything. It's tough to be a generalist like that.
Yeah. That's what I tell people. One of the most difficult parts of trying to be a public scholar is that I have to try to be a generalist to some degree. I have to respond to questions about this, that, and the other. And some of the questions I'm a lot better suited to respond to than others. But even when you just get in, like the field of textual criticism, the deeper you get into it, you see it intersecting with all different kinds of disciplines. And you want to know those other disciplines, and you want to be as well informed as you can about everything that's intersecting with your specialization. And yeah, it becomes unwieldy real quick.
Yeah. For those interested in like the convergence between textual criticism and history and redaction and even exegesis, this is like one of the best books in my opinion. This is New Testament Textual Criticism and Exegesis by J. de Lobel. And it's a bunch of essays on how basically textual criticism of the New Testament and the Old Testament is pretty much the first line before going into exegesis and interpreting a passage, knowing the harmonizations, knowing the history of its understanding, the variants, etc.
But that's something a lot of people don't realize when they talk about Bible translations or anything. You've got a bunch of decisions that have to be made before you even get your source text.
Right.
And a lot of time, most people just punt to the people who've come before, and they just say, I'm just going to accept the decisions they all made. But if you really want to go and make the decisions for yourself, it gets pretty complex.
That's an awesome statement, because in that same book, William Lane Peterson, the late William Lane Peterson, he says that he spoke to a major translator of one of the modern editions of the Bible. He didn't even know what the Nestle Island was. He had no idea. He said he had no idea what it was. So it's still something that's not very well understood even amongst the translators. Yeah.
Got the 27 and the 28 here. You got to know those volumes.
Awesome. And is your PhD thesis, is that available online too?
That is available. The title there is Deity and Divine Agency in the Hebrew Bible, Cognitive Perspectives. And you can also access that through my LinkTree, or you could just Google the title and Exeter. And they have a little system, they call it ORE, and they have all of the PDFs of the dissertations from past PhD students.
And the anti-anthropomorphism in the Verlaga of the LXX, that's also online?
Yes, that's also accessible through my LinkTree. I don't think that Oxford hosts a copy of it. I don't think you can get there by going through Oxford, but I have it posted online in a few different places. So and usually my LinkTree is the easiest way to find my stuff.
I'll make sure to put that in the description of this video as well. But,
and I see a question in the comments about the fit.
Yes, I was gonna ask you that.
So it's the old Todd McFarlane Spider-Man. So.
Awesome. You have a Marvel DC guy and a anime guy on the side. Well,
nice.
I have an anime though, but maybe I should start working on those. But okay, so let's get right into it.
Yeah.
We mentioned you already mentioned in passing the work that you did on the Septuagint, and so this kind of like propels me into the first question, which is, what is the Bible even? A lot of people think that it's Hebrew. It's like the standard Hebrew that we find in the so-called Masoretic text, or in the in the critical editions of the Hebrew Bible, and then that there's a Greek that was based only on that single form of Hebrew. Like a lot of people are still under this impression that the Septuagint, or the Greek New Testament, and the Samaritan text, those are just the same quote unquote Old Testament. I don't like that word, but the same Hebrew Bible. Just translated into a different language with the translator's prerogatives and conventions. What is the reality of the actual recensions, and what is the Bible itself?
That a complex enough question, but the reality is certainly not that there is one text that has just been accurately transmitted and accurately translated, and everything refers back to the original text. In fact, within textual criticism, as I'm sure you've found, they don't even like to talk about the original text, because there's not really a sense in which we have a single text. Because even with like Jeremiah, for instance, when we look at the ancient Greek translation, the Greek translation of Jeremiah is about 16% shorter than what we have in the Masoretic text. And we have fragments from Qumran in Hebrew, where one of the fragments, a lot of the readings agree with the Septuagint version of Jeremiah and not with the Masoretic version of Jeremiah. And so scholars suggest that this fragment from Qumran and the version as preserved in the Septuagint seem to preserve, kind of have frozen in time, this early version of Jeremiah before it had a bunch of other layers added to it. So the text of Jeremiah seems to have been growing and changing as it was being transmitted. And so when we talk about, we don't know how much it grew and changed between our earliest manuscript and when whoever wrote down what they wrote down, because there could have been a real itinerant prophet wandering around in late pre-exilic or exilic Israel, yelling at everybody about how they're doing it all wrong. And, they may have only written down maybe a chapter or two. And maybe a follower later on after they died was like, well, I'm going to fill this out because I heard him talk about all this other stuff. And then maybe a century later, some more people added to it. Like, and Genesis is even more like that. We have even more indications of editorial layers and different stories being brought together. And either one, like you have one creation account set after the other, or you have two different flood accounts that are kind of woven together. Or you have two different versions of Joseph being sold into slavery that are being woven together. And so it's never as simple as just somebody sat down, wrote their text from beginning to end, and then everybody else just based whatever version or translation or manuscript directly on that original text. It's quite a bit more complicated than that. And so everything is really, everything is kind of a cross section of a given time and place, how that text is functioning and is circulating in a given time and place. And it changes all the time, which is why when you look at the Peshitta, the Syriac translation, it's not identical to the Masoretic text. It's not identical to the Septuagint, but scholars are pretty sure that whatever source text the translators of the Peshitta used, it seems to be downstream from the Septuagint rather than directly downstream from what would become the Masoretic text. So we can kind of trace some of the branches out, but what we can't really do very well is go backwards and go upstream and say, where's the original text? That's just something that theoretically we don't even think is possible, much less something that we can do with the resources that are available to us. So it's messy. The water is very muddy. We wish we could see clear to the bottom, but we can't. The best we can do is just try to say at this point in time, this seems to be how these texts were functioning and circulating, and what they meant to the people who copied them and translated them.
Okay, awesome. And you mentioned the differences within Jeremiah, and just like a little anecdote that of how important this subject is. One time I was speaking with a Christian apologist, and we were discussing the priestly rituals and about the sacrifice in the temples, et cetera, et cetera. And Jeremiah chapter 7 seemed to indicate that Jeremiah was under the belief that this was something that God never really ordained, that it was something that the Israelites either perpetuated from their captivity or something that they implemented on their own. And he brought up, I believe it was Jeremiah 31 or 33, where it says, there will never cease to be a priest in the temple to carry out the daily sacrifices and things like that. And in the beginning, I was like, oh, well, that maybe now we can actually interpret them together. But it turns out that passage is actually missing from the Septuagint. And many scholars think that that's like the earlier form. So that kind of, and without that passage, there's really nothing in Jeremiah that is in support of the Levitical practice of like burnt offerings and stuff like that. Can you provide us with some examples of some, or at least one, of a like exegetically important variant between these textual streams that people aren't aware of?
Well, I think the one you brought up is an interesting one, and you referenced Jeremiah 7:22, where God says, on the day I brought you out of Egypt, I did not command you concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. And I'm of the opinion that part of the reason that the author of Jeremiah wants God kind of distancing themselves from some of these things is because some of these commandments might be kind of heinous. For instance, we see in a bunch of places in Exodus 13, in Exodus 34, in Ezekiel 20, we seem to see awareness of some kind of requirement to sacrifice your firstborn child. But usually, as we see in Exodus 13 and Exodus 34, they kind of step in and go, psych, actually, we don't want you to do that, but you have to redeem them. And I think a lot of scholars would suggest that the origin of all of this kind of discomfort with part of the law might be Exodus 22, 29 and 30 in English translations. It's 28 and 29 in the Hebrew, where God says, your firstborn sons you shall give to me. You'll do the same with your oxen and your sheep. 7 days they will be with their mother. On the 8th day, you will give them to me, which seems to be a pretty straightforward requirement for child sacrifice. And so there's an argument that maybe Jeremiah is a little uncomfortable with this, and Jeremiah is having God say, no, I didn't say that. Because and Jeremiah even has God directly rejecting that. I did no such thing. I did not give you any such command. And then we have Jeremiah 7:22.
The NIV adds the word just.
Yeah,
not just command.
Yeah, that's a pretty good example of manipulating the translation because they prioritize the inerrancy and the authority of Scripture which means they need it to be univocal. They need it all to agree. So they cannot have Jeremiah rejecting whatever's going on in Exodus. And so they have to say, oh, I didn't just command you. I did command you regarding that, but not just that. We have a bunch of other places in like Samuel and Kings, for instance, where the Dead Sea Scrolls show that there's some difference in order and content. They have a bunch of different variations like that. And I think one of the most fascinating ones, which is demonstrates that there were complications in the transmission of this text and different editors, redactors going about this differently. You're familiar with the story of Elchanan, who he's credited in 2 Samuel, pretty sure it's 21:19, but let me double check real quick. Pretty sure it's 2 Samuel 21:19. Yes. Elhanan, son of Yareorgim, the Bethlehemite, killed Goliath the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, if we go back to 1 Samuel 17, Goliath the Gittite is described as the one, the shaft of whose spear is like a weaver's beam, but we all know David is supposed to be the one who killed Goliath. And so 2 Samuel 21 seems to have this somewhat problematic other tradition that says, no, it was Elchanan who did it. But then if we go down to the version of this story that is preserved in the books of Chronicles, and here I think it is, 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 5, we have the same story told, but it says Elhanan, son of Jair, killed Lachmi, the brother of Goliath, the Gittite, the shaft of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. And what we probably have is the word Bethlehemite, Beit Lachmi, is probably misunderstood as et Lachmi, so the direct object marker, and then Lachmi as a name, and then after that they have et, which would be the direct object marker from 2 Samuel 21:19, is read as ach, brother of, and so we've got these editors kind of fiddling with the text because the Chronicles editors are looking back and they see first, or the Samuel editors, or no, the Chronicle editors who are working with Samuel see 1 Samuel 17. They're like, David killed Goliath. Why does this say Elchanan killed Goliath? And they fiddle with things to make it all agree. So we see even within the Bible, the editors are kind of scrambling to try to fix things because the received tradition is not lining up the way they think it should. And I don't know if that answered your question the way you wanted me to.
That did, yeah. And that actually goes into my next question. You guys, I swear, every guest, you guys are just like so sharp. You lead me into the next question anyway. But with that, there's even like a discrepancy about the size of Goliath between the Septuagint and the Bible. Okay, can you speak a little about that? I think it's like 4 meters or something like that.
Yeah, depending on the text that you're looking at, it's anywhere from somewhere around 6.5 feet, 6'9", something like that, all the way up to around 9 feet. So there's the Septuagint one I think has the taller one, and probably this is because the translators are looking at this text and they're like, well, that's not that impressive. I mean, yeah. Right. He's a little tall, but I've seen taller, and so they might be pumping up the numbers a little bit just to get Goliath looking a little bigger. And you see that with like the giants and excuse me, I'm still trying to get over a bit of the flu, but you see this with the Nephilim, the giants in Genesis 6 as well. They pop up in numbers when the spies go into the land and they're like, oh, they're giants, they make us look like grasshoppers. And if you think of Goliath as an example of one of these giants, okay, 6 to 9 feet tall, that's that's pretty cool, but that's not too far out of the ordinary. Then you get to the Hellenistic period even later, and you've got the Book of Enoch where they're describing them as 450 feet tall. So they're always trying to one up. The fish gets bigger every time the story gets told over and over again. As we go down through time, we need to make the story more and more impressive.
Gotcha. And my next question was going to be like, because you said about like the different stitched together. I guess this would be something that would introduce people to like the documentary hypothesis. And it reminds me of a statement by D.C. Parker, David Parker, who's one of the editors for the NA28. And he said even if the entirety of the manuscript tradition was completely homogeneous and there was no discrepancy between any two manuscripts, and you have the canonical finished editions of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we can actually still verify that there would have been some changes to the original sources or to the stories because of the way that one text treats the other. And so he calls Matthew our first known scribe, where we actually like may have an idea about what his name is. There's no colophons in any of the earliest manuscripts or anything. So the way that he treats Mark served as kind of like a template for the way that scribes would treat the rest of the manuscript tradition. If they saw, and we know from early Christian history that early church fathers as well, they saw that these changes were in fact significant. And they wrestled with many of them about genealogies, about nativity, about certain Christological episodes. And so this might have given leeway to the scribes to say, well, if Matthew did this with Mark, why can't I do this with Matthew's text itself? And so do you think that something like that might have happened with the general atmosphere with regards to scribes of the Hebrew Bible as well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think you do have, there are a number of ways that Chronicles is toying with Samuel and Kings, and probably because they're receiving traditions where they can tell that people before are meddling with things. You know, you've got the Deuteronomistic tradition, you've got the priestly tradition, you've got non-P traditions. And so whoever's responsible for Chronicles is very clearly aware that there are changes being made. And in that time period, I don't think there was as much concern for the sanctity of the text as text. Like, we see a text and we're like, oh, we can't change a letter, because we think of the text as being the locus of authority. It's got to be in writing because that means it's authoritative. But anciently, it wasn't really like that. The authority was the message, not necessarily the ink on papyrus that communicated the message. And so this is why when Jesus talks about the words of God or God's word in the New Testament, he's not talking about scripture. He's talking about the message, where the scripture is just a means of communication. It's just the channel for the message. And so I think in the periods of the composition and transmission of the Hebrew Bible, that's how they're thinking of things. That's why at Qumran you can have 20 different manuscripts of Genesis, and they all differ from each other in a bunch of ways, because really what they're concerned about is the message. And even today, apologists retreat to that. Like, the goalposts always get moved to that. They'll start off with the claim that, you know, the great Isaiah scroll is word for word identical to the Masoretic text. And once somebody says, no, it's not, they're like, well, no central Christian doctrines are affected by the differences. Exactly. At which point they're basically doing the same thing. Well, it's not the exact words on the page, it's just the general message that they communicate. And so I think you have that's kind of it, where people are starting from, until around the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century CE. And what I think going on here within Christianity is you're getting a generation or more away from Jesus. You're no longer talking to people who have a plausible claim to have heard directly from the mouth of Jesus the words that they're sharing. I think they thought of the living words of Jesus as having the most authority, and the scriptures being kind of dead letters, so to speak. But then once you no longer have someone who can say, I sat on my mother's lap and listened to Jesus, then I think they kind of go, maybe the text needs to be where we default to. And so I think the locus of authority goes from the words as spoken words to the words as text on a page, or words on a page. And that's when suddenly the inviolability of the text starts to bubble to the surface. And now we've got people going, we need to make sure this all is the same. We need to make sure we're transmitting this correctly. And I think Judaism and Christianity around the 2nd century CE, that's where you see this pivot towards, okay, we need to take care of these texts. We need to make sure they're all as close to each other as possible. And that's where you get the recensions of the Septuagint, where you get Symmachus and Aquila and others, where suddenly the Septuagint is kind of being recalibrated toward this proto-Masoretic tradition as the text becomes the locus of authority. So I think you do see they're a little more cavalier with stuff prior to the 2nd century CE, and then suddenly it's like, well, no, we gotta make sure the texts are all the same. But I think there was still a degree to which they thought, at least interpreting things, we have license from, the Gospels. If they're telling it in different ways, then we can we have license from them to, kind of mush them together and interpret in the way that serves our interests. Since, Matthew's doing that, like Matthew has Jesus riding into Jerusalem on 2 donkeys at the same time. So obviously we have a little liberty here with how we tell these stories.
Yeah, and I think even up until like the 4th or 5th century, one of my favorite quotations, patristic quotations of all time, is Jerome when he's discussing the passage in Matthew 27 about the pieces of silver and the potter's field. He says, "Tell all of these hunters of words who are kind of obsessed with the niceties of language that the apostles were not interested in the precise order nor the precise words themselves, but rather with the establishment of dogma." And so he felt that even the New Testament authors, they felt free to kind of, for better lack of a word, to manipulate the Hebrew Bible in a way to where it serves their purpose. And he goes on a whole list of where the Vulgate differs from the Septuagint. The Septuagint varies from the Hebrew, and then some passages in the New Testament don't pretty much line up with any recension that we know of. And so this seems to have been something that was like even held too much later on. And that leads me to like my third question, which is, what role does authorship play in how we perceive these texts? I know most people think that and I've interviewed like Ross Nichols and Idan Dershowitz on the problems with authorship in the Hebrew Bible. But what can you tell us about the status questionis of the Mosaic nature of, let's say, the Pentateuch?
Well, I think the overwhelming majority of scholars these days agree that Moses, if he existed at all, certainly didn't have much, if anything, to do with the composition of the Pentateuch. But you do see very early on people saying, well, so-and-so wrote this, and it's always somebody who is known from history, and that arrogates more authority to the text. And this is why a lot of people still want to know who wrote Hebrews. Like, no, but there aren't really scholars out there who think Paul wrote Hebrews, but people really want to know. And the idea that it might be someone they've never heard of before, who maybe had no authority, is very uncomfortable for an awful lot of folks. They want it to be like Timothy, or they want it to be some prominent Christian that is known from history, because they need to lash some authority to it. They need somebody who's close to the ground and to these events to be the one who wrote it. And the same, I think, is true for the Pentateuch. Moses would be like the best person to have written all these things. If it was just some random dude who didn't really have any authority, certainly didn't witness any of these events, I think that saps some of the power and the authority from the text. But when it comes to the composition of the Pentateuch, these days scholars are pretty in widespread agreement that you have a D strand, the Deuteronomistic literature, which goes beyond the Pentateuch as well, which is probably started under King Josiah, but has a school that kind of lasts for a couple centuries after that. You've got the priestly school, the priestly strand, which also, it may or may not be pre-exilic. Some people think it's pre-exilic. Other people think it's exilic, but that lasts for a couple centuries as well. And then you've got a bunch of other stuff, whether they're fragments or supplements or whatever, that they refer to as non-P. And some of these are coming before D and P. Some of them are coming after. Things like the Covenant Code probably come from 8th, 7th century BCE.
Some layman Christians are listening to you talk, thinking about their gear lever. I just wanted to go ahead.
Yeah, when we start talking about all these different letters, it can get kind of confusing. But it gets worse when you get into New Testament textual criticism, because everything's P this and P that. But yeah, these are texts that are being brought together over a period of multiple centuries by generations and generations of schools of thought and tradition within ancient Israel and Judah and early Judaism. And the people want Moses to be the author real bad, but the data just don't support that at all. And the first people who noticed that there seemed to be different sources involved, that goes back to Christians in like the 16 and 1700s are the first to say, I see different sources here. And their assumption was, well, Moses must have been gathering different sources and put them together to create the composition that is the Pentateuch. And then later scholars are like, what indicates that Moses had anything at all to do with this? And there's not really a good answer to that, which leads to the current consensus thinking. And I think there's been a lot of criticism of the documentary hypothesis, and a lot of folks who are not paying much attention to that criticism kind of falsely have concluded that means scholars are defaulting back to Mosaic authorship or unified authorship. In fact, when I was in my second master's degree at Trinity Western University, we had another student who became a good friend of mine who came from a D-min. No, not a D-min. I mean, an MDiv.
He came from a demon?
No. D-min would be Doctor of Ministry. But I should have been thinking of MDiv, a Master of Divinity. So he came from a Bible college where he got a master's degree, and he came in and they started talking about D and P and everything, and he raised his hand and he said, in my master's degree, they taught us that the documentary hypothesis had been debunked, and we all just went back to Mosaic authorship. And the professor kind of sighed and was like, oh boy. But explained, no, that's a misrepresentation of what's going on. There's been criticism of it, but it has only become more complex. It's not like the whole thing has been abandoned. We've just moved beyond some assumptions that were not warranted by the data. And there are a lot of folks out there who seem to think that criticism of the documentary hypothesis means exoneration, of Mosaic authorship, and nothing could be further from the truth. And unfortunately, there's a lot of apologetic thinking that that latches onto that because there's not really much else for them to latch on to.
Yeah, I sometimes analogize this with like the theory of evolution, although I myself don't subscribe to the theory. But they'll say, like, for example, well, the Royal Academy of Sciences, they said that the modern synthesis is not adequate to explain this or that, and so people will think, oh well, the theory of evolution is gone, but no, they have endosymbiosis and neutral theory and stuff like that. So definitely, I understand what you're saying. And Joel Biden's book, The Composition of the Pentateuch, it speaks about that as well, about like in literary details. But thank you for mentioning that. And as far as you mentioned earlier, that maybe Jeremiah was uncomfortable with some of the things that were being practiced. This kind of brings me into the question that I'm going to ask you now. Like some of the more uncomfortable, clearly outlined things in the Bible. For example, the I don't want to say obsession, but the insistence on preserving the sanctity of the man. You spoke about this in a beautiful video on TikTok that I saw, where you were discussing a passage in Deuteronomy about if a person comes across a woman and he lays hold of her and seizes her. But then there are two versions of that. One is if she's betrothed, and one is if she's not betrothed. Mm-hmm. And then there are some other passages where it seems like the concern is not so much for like equity or justice, but rather to preserve the again like the sanctity or the honor of the man, where it says she played a harlot in her father's house, et cetera, et cetera. Can you speak about those specific examples? Because when we speak to Christians about it, they seem to kind of conjure up an imaginary context that kind of makes these things okay.
Yeah, there's there's the assumption that the way we think about these as moral issues today is exactly how they thought about them anciently. And sex is one of the things that is the most wildly divergent from how they thought about it anciently, because we tend to think about, sex outside of marriage, adultery, sexual assault, all these things as immoral because there's just a moral principle or a rule behind these actions that equally apply to everybody. And so you don't violate that moral principle or rule, and so it's wrong. But anciently, it really wasn't so much about any kind of notion that the act of sex itself has all of this moral weight to it. It was really about things like property rights. And so you talked about Deuteronomy 22, where we have these issues with what happens if there is sexual assault or adultery, and the woman is either married or she's betrothed but not yet married, or she's not yet betrothed. And the difference in punishments indicates that the victim is not the woman. The victim is whoever has rights over her sexual availability and her procreative capacity. Because if a woman has become betrothed to another man, then he has paid a price to her father, and she is now at least her sexual availability and her procreative capacities are now his property. And so to sexually assault her is to render her damaged goods, is to violate his property rights, and the punishment there is death. But if she's not yet betrothed, then there's no man who has purchased those rights. It's the father who has the future financial benefit to gain from her marriage, who possesses those rights. And so sexual assault of an unbetrothed woman is a violation of his property rights. But because that exchange has not taken place, it's not as serious a crime. And so the penalty is that the father is owed a fine, and then the perpetrator has to marry the woman, and he's not allowed to divorce her. Basically, he's rendered her damaged goods, and so now he's got to take care of her so that she's not out on the street and, unemployable and cannot participate in proper Israelite society. And you see this in a bunch of different ways with the rape of Dinah, for instance. It's not a question of Dinah being the victim. It's a question of the honor of her family, and particularly the men in her family, being compromised. And it happens over and over and over again, where the penalties and the narratives and everything suggest that sex was not something that two equal partners mutually engaged in. Sex was something that an active sexual agent did to a passive sexual object. And the agency and the consent of that passive sexual object wasn't really relevant. And so, and this is why even today, unfortunately, it's disgusting, but there are a lot of men today who argue that there's no such thing as marital rape, because if a man is married to a woman, he has unilateral rights to her body. And that would be a pretty accurate description of how marriage was understood in the ancient world. And that's not to say there was not romance. That's not to say there were not divergences from this kind of basic social ideal. But yeah, sex was very different anciently, and which was why adultery was a woman committed adultery anytime she had sex with anyone who was not her husband. A man only committed adultery if the other woman he was having sex with, who was not his wife, was already married to another man, because polygamy was normative. A man could have sex with as many women as he wanted, as long as they were not married to somebody else. So adultery was really a one-way street. Women were the only ones who were always guilty of adultery if they were having sex with somebody they weren't married to. Men weren't really guilty of adultery until we get to Greco-Roman period Judaism and we get to the New Testament. And then things have shifted because of Greek philosophy, because of Roman society and all these things. And then there's some more parity, but it still doesn't make men and women equal. Women are still subordinate to men inside the home. So lots of different ways that we don't think about how different their social and ethical frameworks and structures were anciently, but they're very, very different. And we frequently just assume we can transfer things wholesale from the Bible to today without recognizing that those things are constructed on entirely different foundations. And so that transfer is frequently inappropriate and doing violence to what's going on in the Bible.
And hermeneutically, what do you suggest for Christians or readers of the Bible? Because it's easy to say, you know what, just set aside your biases and look at the text as it is, and then learn a bit of Hebrew, and you'll know the answer. But like, what is being an academic and being somebody who studied it from a hermeneutical, exegetical perspective, what should be the mindset or like the protocol for when you approach texts like this? Is it contextualizing it with the time period? Is it like Near Eastern similarities? Is it intertextuality, or is it everything, all the above?
Well, I think first it depends on what you're trying to do with the text, because I think I prioritize on my channel a historical critical approach, which means what I'm trying to do is, to the degree possible, I'm trying to reconstruct an ancient mind so that I can try to construct meaning with the text that will come as close as possible to what would have made it meaningful and useful for that ancient mind. And I'm trying to get as close as I can to either the author or the earliest audiences of the text. That's a specific approach for a specific reason, because on my channel, I want to try to represent that approach as a kind of jumping off point. This is a point of departure for further discussion about the Bible, and I'm going to represent that point of view. However, folks who accept the authority, the inspiration of the Bible will want to use it to apply to today, in which case there are a variety of different contextual theologies and other hermeneutic lenses they can bring to the text to try to make it meaningful. But what I try to advocate for is at least starting from an understanding of what it would have meant to the earliest audiences, because if we don't do that, I think we run into the problem of leveraging text in problematic ways, making the Bible less problematic than it originally was. I think glosses over a lot of things. So for instance, in Proverbs, he who spares the rod hates his child. There's an argument that a lot of people make that the word rod there doesn't mean a rod of discipline, but a shepherd's crook, a shepherd's staff, which is not used to hit sheep, but to gently guide them. And so they reinterpret this to mean this is not about hitting children. This is about gently guiding them. And that's a renegotiation with the text that I think is wonderful, as long as you first acknowledge that in the context of Proverbs, 100% it was about beating your kids with a stick. Because you can find multiple different passages in Proverbs that say it even more explicitly. Like in Proverbs 24, it says, if you beat your child with a stick, you will not kill them. You will save their soul from Sheol.
Solomon.
What's that?
W. Solomon. My son's listening right now, so I just...
Okay. So it's it quite explicitly advocates for beating children in the book of Proverbs. And I think we can, as long as we acknowledge starting off, hey, this is what this meant anciently, we're going to put a pin in that. We don't agree with that, but now let's then transparently negotiate with it. I think that's perfectly valid, as long as people are being open about that stuff, because otherwise it glosses over the fact that this text was actually advocating for violence against children. And I think what that does is that allows people to, one, when people get educated enough to find out for themselves what it was originally about, they're going to lose trust and confidence in the people who told them it was something else. That's one problem. And the other problem is it allows bad actors to smuggle that stuff in and say, oh, you're the one who said that we should use this text, and I'm just showing you what it actually means. That and they could use that to validate and rationalize beating children today, which is phenomenally harmful. And I've got a chapter in my forthcoming book, The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues, where I talk about why I think it's problematic to try to gloss over that passage from Proverbs and treat it as if it is something good.
Is that book out yet?
This comes out on April 29th, so it's not quite out yet. This is this is an advanced reader copy that I got sent.
Definitely.
But pre-orders are available, yes. And I'm, let's see, about a month from now, I will be recording the audiobook version, the narration for the audiobook. So
okay, I'll put the
so
link.
hopefully my voice is better by then.
Your voice,
and I'm not, and I'm not coughing all the time.
Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna put all the links to that stuff in the bottom as well.
Awesome, thank you.
My pleasure. Now that we've discussed a little bit of like the hermeneutical principles, and I agree with you, authorial intent is what you should. Whether you're looking at it from a historical perspective or from a theological perspective, you still want to know what the author meant. And if he meant to convey a theological message, then surely that's those two things are going to converge anyway. Now, like we've discussed some of the more like tantalizing, more provocative passages, but I want to focus on some passages that scholars such as yourself and people like Jason Bedun in his work Truth in Translation, he tried to highlight some of these, but most people have never read that book or have not like read your scholarly academic publications. But I wanted to know if we can start with like because I don't have you for too much longer, but with like Genesis 1:1. It's literally the beginning of the Hebrew Bible, and a lot of Christians and just maybe passive readers of the Bible who see like the word Elohim, which says in the beginning, Barashit, God Elohim created the heavens and the earth, and they extrapolate from that the idea that God is multi-personal or maybe pluralistic in some other way. Can you tell us a little bit about how that text was understood classically, or what your research has concluded with regards to the term Elohim and with its relation to that particular passage and throughout the Bible in general?
Yeah, the word Elohim in Hebrew is grammatically plural. It's probably the plural of the singular Eloah or Eloha, which is a probably the most rare way to say the word God that we find in the Hebrew Bible. But it's grammatically plural. However, it occurs overwhelmingly. It's the most common word for God in the whole Bible, but it occurs overwhelmingly with singular verbs, pronouns, and things like that, indicating it is used with a singular sense. And there's a wonderful book called A Reassessment of Biblical Elohim by Joel Burnett. It's almost 25 years old now, that talks about how this is a phenomenon that we see in a variety of Semitic languages. It's in Akkadian, it's in Northwest Semitic languages, it's in other languages in addition to
Arabic
Hebrew.
too. It's in Arabic.
Is it in Arabic too?
Yeah.
And traditionally, there's been this idea of the what they call the plural of majesty, where the idea is by rendering it plural, you're just multiplying the majesty, whatever the nature of this word that is being referred to, you're multiplying that. And Joel points out in the book that this is problematic because you also find in other Semitic languages the word for slave being used the exact same way, that it's being used in the plural but with singular markers. So some scholars have said, oh well, that's the plural of humility. So it's the exact same thing. They can't have one be majesty and one be humility. But what he argues is that it probably originates as an abstract plural. So Eloha would have been pluralized to mean not God, but divinity, the abstraction of God. But then that abstract plural would have been used a bunch to refer to a specific deity, and that would cause the concretization of the abstract plural. And there's another example he points to of this happening in the Hebrew Bible. Earlier in Deuteronomy 22, where we have the case of the man and the woman come together, and he suspects that she's not a virgin on their wedding night, and the defense that the bride can bring or is expected to bring is the plural of Betullah in Hebrew. It's the abstract plural. So it should be she's supposed to bring her virginity to the elders or something like that. But that obviously doesn't mean the abstraction. It's the concretization, the material evidence of her virginity, which most scholars, the sheets, is what most scholars suggest was going on there, which represents a misunderstanding of how the female body frequently works. Mm-hmm. But But that's an example of something that was made into a plural, an abstract plural, but then used in reference to concrete instantiations of that abstraction. And so the same is probably going on with Elohim. And so, in short, it became an abstraction that then was reconcretized, but the use of the plural continued. And so Elohim just means deity, or it can be the simple plural deities, or in that you can still have the abstract sense used, or the you can have the adjectival sense used, so it can mean divine. And so what we have in Genesis 1:1 is Bereshit bara Elohim, and bara is if we interpret it according to the Masoretic vocalization and the Septuagint's interpretation, it's a finite verb. It is a call, third masculine singular. And so the verb is in the singular. And so Elohim must be understood as the singular noun. So it would just be God or deity created the heavens and the earth. Now, when it comes to the first word, Bereshit, that word is always in the construct everywhere it occurs. I think it occurs 7 other times in the Hebrew Bible, every single time in the construct, meaning it's not in the beginning God created, it's in the beginning of God creating. Or more idiomatically, it is a temporal clause introducing something that follows. And so when God began to create would be a more accurate translation. And then verses 2 and 3 describe the state of affairs when God began to create. Well, when God began to create, the earth was, welter and waste, and the darkness hovered over the surface of the waters. And then God said, "Let there be light." So that's the first creative act. And there's already material there. And so a lot of folks are uncomfortable with that consensus view these days regarding what Genesis 1:1 means, because it kind of undermines creation ex nihilo, or creation out of nothing. Mm-hmm. But yeah, there are folks who suggest it should be translated "the gods created," but that's not supported by any data.
Right. And I'm sure that they're not like, it would have to be consistently applied for like Elohim throughout the Bible, which would be a little bit absurd.
Yeah. But we do have later in Genesis 1, in Genesis 1:26, it says, "And God said," and Elohim there is singular because the verb is singular, Vayomer Elohim. God said, "Let us make humanity in our image and in our likeness." So the deity is speaking to other deities, and scholars are in pretty widespread agreement that this is the concept of the divine council. God is collaborating with the other deities to plan the creation of humanity. So there are other deities involved, but in Genesis 1, the word Elohim is always used in the singular.
Awesome. Thank you. And this kind of makes me jump towards John 1:1. In John 1:1, you have kind of like a similar idea where it says in arche and halagos, etc., that in the beginning was the word was with God, and the word was God. That's how it's usually translated in many in actually every Bible it's translated like that. But is there something similar with the idea of I know you've explained this before about theos without the definite article or with the definite article? Because again, a lot of people will read that and they'll say, well, yeah, here we have one person and another person, and voila, you have binitarianism.
Right. Well, I think, you definitely have something going on in John 1:1c. Theos ino logos is what the Greek says. And there's no definite article there. And even in English, you kind of get the same idea. There's, deity or the deity. Without this could refer to any deity, anybody occupying that category of deity. And there have been a bunch of different arguments, but I think Daniel Wallace makes clear enough that this is probably qualitative, because when you have a noun that refers to either somebody well-known or somebody who has already been mentioned in close connection, in a predication, and a predication is X is Y, where you have two things that are identified with a to be verb. When that noun comes before the verb in a predication, if it is either well-known or already been mentioned, it should have the definite article. And here there is no definite article, which suggests this is not the deity, but this is a word that is used to describe the qualities possessed by the Logos. And now Daniel Wallace then goes on to say, but rendering the word was divine could lead to misunderstanding. And there, Daniel Wallace is appealing to the Trinitarian presuppositions that are being brought to the text, that there is only one deity and that the God of Israel exhausts the category of deity. So you cannot have anything that is divine that is not God. And that I would argue that those presuppositions are not merited, because no such ideas can be shown to have been in circulation when the Gospel of John was written. Those are ideas that developed after the composition of the Gospel of John. So I think a better translation would be something like the word was divine, or the word was deity, or something like that. And there's a scholar named Smarius, I think it's Alexander Smarius, who recently wrote, in 2022, published a paper in Horizons in Biblical Theology. The paper is entitled Another God in the Gospel of John, a linguistic analysis of John 1:1 and 1:18, and argues that linguistic considerations are compelling enough to consider a different interpretation. The word can be understood as a second, non-competitive deity, a notion that is not as incompatible with John's monotheism as is generally thought. I think there are some great points that Smarius brings up in that article for why the traditional understanding that this is referring to the Logos as the very God of Israel is problematized.
Yeah,
it's problematic.
It's as if Justin Martyr wrote that passage.
Yeah,
he calls him,
or Philo, another God, or a second God. Yeah,
or Origin and Heraclides. This idea is very ancient. Which can you just tell us about that? This idea of Logos theology and how it was used.
Well, yeah, I think the Logos theology that we see in Philo and probably in John is based on kind of overlaying Greek philosophical lenses on the text and trying to flesh out exactly what's going on using presuppositions about the difference between deity and humanity. In Platonic thought, these are two incommensurate categories. Humanity is corrupt and changeable, and deity is incorrupt and unchangeable. And so the two don't really go together. But the Logos is a way that they've rationalized that deity can connect with humanity, can enter into, become a part of, can commune with via this kind of ontological bridge that is provided by the Logos. And so that's a way to bridge the gap that exists between the divine and the human, at least in Greco-Roman, Jewish, and then in early Christian thought. But this brings up the fact that there are a variety of different ways that you can connect those dots. And later on, when the Trinity developed, everybody kind of decided, all right, we're going to distill it down to one. There's only going to be one answer, and that's going to be authoritative. And that's what happens at Nicaea and later in later councils. But in the early years, you have a bunch of different people with a bunch of different ideas about how to make sense of the relationship of Jesus to God. Yeah. And while certainly there are those going around saying Jesus is God, if you were to ask them, okay, explain how precisely, you're going to get as many different answers as you have people that you're asking, because there's no one authoritative way to make sense of it. And what I've argued in my in epilogue to my book Adonai's Divine Images, I also argued it in a paper I published in a journal called Biblical Interpretation, is that it kind of made sense to people, because the question of some representative both being the deity and not being the deity is precisely how everybody is thinking about divine images, which were ubiquitous in the ancient world. Everybody was already kind of set up to think about entities as both being the deity and not being the deity. And so it kind of made it intuitive, and people didn't really question it. It was just like, yeah, that makes sense, whatever. But then later on, you get people arguing about how to make precise sense of it. And then you have imperial authorities saying, fix it. I don't care how you fix it. Just fix it. Just come up with a single answer. And unfortunately, the Arians got the short end of that stick.
Yeah. And some manuscripts legitimately fixed it by adding the definite article to C, like Codex Washingtonianus. And so churches actually read it as if in like a modalistic way. But
Yeah.
is it proper to understand John 1:1, for example, like people like I'm sorry, James Dunn understands it with like as maybe a reference to Proverbs, maybe like wisdom literature, where Jesus is just kind of like a poetic representation of God's authority and will?
Well, I think you have a lot of examples in Greco-Roman period Judaism of kind of different meditations on divine mediation, because wisdom is personified in Proverbs 8, only it's personified kind of as a woman. And then you also have the Sophia, the who is in Greek culture even more personified. But you have a bunch of different examples of this. The Son of Man is a divine mediator. The Logos is a divine mediator. You've got the wisdom idea. You've got the Shekhinah idea. You've got the Memra in Aramaic that Boyarin likes to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you have a bunch of different potential kind of vehicles for divine mediation that are contributing to the different people thinking about it in different ways. And so I certainly think that there were people who would be like, yeah, it's kind of like the angel of the Lord, or yeah, it's kind of like wisdom, or yeah, it's kind of like the Son of Man. And then you got the Son of God concept. Michael Peppard's book, The Son of God in the Roman World, talks about adoptionist Christology and Mark, and how the Son of God, as an adopted son, has more authority and more power. And so I think you have a bunch of different ways that God's representation is being represented. And the only one that Jesus never seems to get directly identified with is the Spirit, because that's always distinguished from Jesus in the Gospels. And that then becomes the third person of the Trinity. But yeah,
he's described as the Holy Spirit in the Shepherd of Hermas.
Yeah. Touche. Yeah, I forgot about that one.
some manuscripts change it, like the Latin version of Hermas. Yeah.
But that just demonstrates that in the earliest years, there were just a lot of different ways to make sense of it that were in circulation. And to say, well, we're going to take what they later decided, and we're just going to assume that everybody knew the entire time. Like that's not how any of this works.
That's anachronistic. Yeah. And all of those different models of mediation, did any of them ever believe that the Memra or the Shekhinah or the Logos, that was like ontologically the same, Most High God? Or was it just like a model of showing how God interacted with the world?
I'm sure there were folks who tried to who thought of it that way. I don't think that we have the articulation of any fleshed out arguments for how that it could be. I would, if we do, they're probably in kind of minority languages and minority texts. But I have to imagine that somebody was thinking of it in terms of ontology. There's a book called Jesus Among the Gods by Michael Bird, that and the main argument he's trying to make is that the Gospel of John is definitely thinking about Jesus's ontological identity with God. And he brings in the Gnostics, and he brings in some other discussions. And so I think it was probably on people's minds in the 2nd century CE, but I don't know that I've ever seen an articulation of that notion until we get to kind of the proto-Trinitarian stuff.
Okay. And you mentioned, again, you made a perfect segue to the Son of Man concept. I gave up trying to understand what the Son of Man was after Bart Ehrman said it confuses him. I'm like, I'm good. So I know that it has its not origins, but has like some representation of it in like Enoch, and of course in Daniel and in the New Testament. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what the history of that concept was and how it was interpreted?
Well, you see,
Christians again would point at it as Jesus riding on the clouds of heaven. God rides on the clouds of heaven. So syllogism, Jesus is God.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big the question of what Jesus's relationship to God is kind of like an algebra problem. We've got all these texts from the Hebrew Bible that say God is X. And then we got the New Testament where they swoop in and say Jesus is X. And so we got to figure out how to solve for X. And there are a bunch of different ways that you can solve for X. And so too many people just want to immediately say, well, our solution works, so that's the one that it must have been the entire time. But we already have people solving this equation in the Hebrew Bible and in Greco-Roman period Jewish literature that does not match the later Christian solution for X. But the Son of Man, we see it in Hebrew in Ezekiel, for instance, where it's being used according to this Hebrew idea where you can refer to a member of a category by saying son or daughter of that category. So Bat Adam would mean a daughter of man or a daughter of humanity, which would mean a human woman. And then Ben Nevi'im, a son of the prophets, that would be a prophet. And you also have B'nai Elohim, the children of God, that would be gods. And so Ben Adam in Hebrew is the son of man. It just means a human. And then in Daniel 7, what we have is the Aramaic Bar Enosh, which would be son of a mortal. And so we have this description of somebody, and it says who looks like a Bar Enosh, somebody who looks like a human. That it's just a description of somebody who is humanoid, anthropomorphic in appearance, looks like a human, came to the Ancient of Days. And then when this gets translated into Greek, we go from Bar Enosh, which is an easy to understand idiom in Aramaic, and it goes into Greek, and suddenly it's not an easy to understand idiom anymore. It sounds like a title. And so it becomes kind of a title. And then we have an old Greek translation of Daniel 7, where instead of saying the Son of Man came to the Ancient of Days, Heos, Ancient of Days, you have Hos, which is a difference of just one letter, but it entirely changes the meaning. And it says the Son of Man came as the Ancient of Days, which would seem to equate the two in some way. And that would make sense of calling the Son of Man riding the clouds, because Adonai is the cloud rider. And of course, Baal was the cloud rider before Adonai. But and this is just imagery associated with the Northwest Semitic storm deity. So it's nothing exclusive to Adonai. But here we're kind of it's kind of riffing on this tradition that we have with the angel of the Lord, the Malach Adonai, who not only seems to have their identity conflated with God, but at least in Exodus 3:6 says to Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And in verse 2, it says this is the angel of the Lord who appeared in a flame of fire in the burning bush to Moses, who is saying this. And so you've got this notion that God's representatives, that God's agents are also somehow identified as God. That's already going on in the Hebrew Bible. And Exodus 23:20 through 21, I think, is trying to give an explanation for how this can happen. Because God says, look, I'm sending an angel before you to guide you on the way. Don't disobey him. Don't tick him off, because he does not have to forgive your transgressions, because my name is in him. And what I argue is that this is understanding the divine name as a vehicle for divine agency and authority and presence. And again, we're going back to the logic of divine images, because one of the ways you would activate a divine image anciently was to inscribe the deity's name on it. And then, you go zzz, and then suddenly the deity is inhabiting the divine image. And, sometimes it was zzz with the left hand, maybe sometimes it was with the right hand. You had some kind of ritual that enlivened the statue. And so what I have argued is that when you see these Greco-Roman period Jewish ideas about divine mediation, where the other entity is somehow their identity is mixed in with God's identity, there's always a role for the divine name to play. And that entity is some kind of possessor of the divine name. You see that in the Apocalypse of Abraham with an angel named Yahoel, who tells Abraham, I do all these things that only God is supposed to be able to do by virtue of the divine name which dwells in me. And you have other examples of this going all the way down to like 5th century CE rabbinic Judaism. You have a heretic comes to the rabbi, Ravi Idit, I think, and says, hey, what about this passage where God says, come up to Adonai? Why doesn't God say, come up to me? And the rabbi says, well, that's because they're talking about Metatron, whose name is like God's name. And yes. Metatron is the angel who has God's name, is the Adonai Katon, the little Adonai in another story. And so the divine name kind of endows the possessor with divine agency, divine power, and even the divine presence. And so what I've argued is that the folks who are seeing the Son of Man, as the rider of the clouds, that's imagery associated with God's presence. Great. The Son of Man has it as well. And when people talk about Mark 2 and how Jesus can forgive sins, and his accusers are there going, who can forgive sins but God alone? Jesus doesn't say, what do you think that makes me? Wink, wink. Jesus says, no, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. I say to you, rise up and walk. And demonstrating that they were wrong. Their idea that only God is allowed to forgive sins is wrong, because guess who else can do it? The Son of Man.
Right.
So I think when we look at all of the data and we look at the ideological development going on in Greco-Roman period Judaism and early Christianity, there are better answers. There are better ways to solve for X than immediately retreating to Nicaea and the Nicene Creed. But because that's a very strong dogma within Nicene Christianity, imagine that, a lot of folks are resistant to finding better answers.
No, yeah. And I frequently have to do this even with Muslim apologists who try to interpret certain passages that are clearly Platonic and imbue some sort of deification for Jesus, as they try to make it prophetic or something that is more in line with what we believe. But no, just let John say what John wants to say. No, it's fine.
That's something I say in the introduction of my book. If you really want to understand the Bible on its own terms, you have to be willing to let the Bible disagree with you. You have to be willing to let it say something that is different from what you believe. And if you're not willing to do that, then you're not reading the Bible on its own terms. You're demanding the Bible be subordinate to your terms.
That's awesome. And I think we've discussed so much, and I've held you a little bit longer than we agreed. I really appreciate all the insight that you provided us for us today. And if possible, can you just leave us with, because this interview was supposed to be geared towards, and alhamdulillah, thank God we did actually accomplish that, I believe, geared towards giving us an understanding about how to approach texts in general, how to what tools do we need in order to get to the authorial intent or the objective of the author in the message that they were trying to convey. In your studies, in your career as a theologian and as a historian of the Bible, what can you tell us? What I guess nuggets of wisdom can you offer us about how to approach historical texts so we don't end up making the mistakes that you frequently highlight on your TikTok videos and end up being the subject of one of your rebuttals?
One thing I would say is if you have some historical text, something from long ago, and the way you read it seems to indicate that they would agree exactly with you about some current issue, where they are condemning exactly the right person so that you can fit it perfectly into your own circumstances, be wary of those readings, because that is probably your subconscious just overlaying the text with its own concerns and interpreting it in a way that serves your interests. And so trying to read through a historical critical lens is difficult, because it means we have to be constantly questioning what interpretations we're coming up with, and constantly trying to recalibrate our interpretive lenses to fit the ancient world. So I would say the less it makes sense to you and the less it feels relevant to you, probably the closer you're getting to what it would have meant for an ancient author or audience. That's not to say it can never be directly relevant, but I would say just be careful if it's that's exactly like today, because that's probably when you're abandoning the historical critical lenses and just reading for yourself. So I think that would be the number one thing I would say, is be wary of those instances where it really sets off that tuning fork in your own heart, because that probably indicates that's where it's coming from. It's not coming from the text itself.
I agree. So thank you so much. We've discussed what the Bible is, the different forms of the Hebrew Bible, because that is your specialty. And thank you for sharing that with us. We discussed some interpretations of passages that have often been either misinterpreted or not interpreted with enough careful, like, exegetical focus. And I think this video is going to be a very good resource for people to just understand, one, the ethical framework that the Bible operates in, the history of the transmission of the Bible, and of course we've mentioned so many sources, including your own work, and the forthcoming book, God willing, that we will all be purchasing, in which people are free to go and, again, like I say, all of these interviews are supposed to be like scholarly and academic, not apologetic in nature. And so anything that you can discover tangentially in the course of this conversation, go into the footnotes, like I say, go into the rabbit holes, and arm yourself with this knowledge, and you'll come out better at the other end. So I want to thank you, Dr. Dan, for blessing us with your presence today, and everything was very, very highly enlightening and elucidating for many of us.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your time.
My pleasure. Is there anything you want to leave us with, other than the book that you mentioned? Any of your work that you would like us to check out?
Well, in addition to my social media channels, I also have the Data Over Dogma podcast, which has episodes that come out every Monday morning. So
Wow.
for folks who would like some longer form content, or for whatever reason might find my dulcet tones soothing in the morning for a commute to work or something like that, the Data Over Dogma podcast is also a great place to go.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll be reviewing this interview and making sure that I update it with your LinkTree to the a pre-order of the book, and everything, God willing, is going to be in the description. So again, thank you so much. We like to end every stream with what's called it's like the conclusive prayer before every. It's called Kafaratul Majlis. I don't even know how to translate that in English, but basically, Subhanak Allahumma bihamdik, glory be to you, God, and with your praise. Ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, I bear witness that there is no deity except for you. Astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk, I seek your forgiveness and I turn to you. And thank you, everybody, for joining and for contributing. God willing, we'll see you on the next one. Assalamu alaikum, and have a good day.